My daughter sent me a text on a Tuesday afternoon. 5 words. Don't bring Dad to dinner. I read it 3 times standing in the driveway, still in my work boots, holding a bag of groceries I'd picked up on the way home from the hardware store. I remember the weight of the bag. 2 cans of soup, a loaf of bread, some oranges. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to focus on, the oranges, when my chest had just caved in. She didn't mean her father, she meant my wife. My wife of 31 years, Marlene, who had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's the previous spring, whose hands shook when she poured coffee, who sometimes lost her train of thought mid-sentence. My daughter, Brooke, didn't want her mother at Sunday dinner because it made her new husband uncomfortable. That was how it started. I want to be clear about who I am before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario, the son of a man who worked the nickel mines for 30 years without ever complaining once. I spent most of my adult life as a civil engineer. I built roads, bridges, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure you don't notice until it isn't there. I retired 3 years ago. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't raise my voice. I've never in my life stormed out of a room. I solve problems quietly, or I let them sit until I know what to do with them. When Brooke was small, she used to ride on my shoulders around the backyard while I watered the garden. She called me Big Bear. She made me cards on Father's Day with stick figure drawings of the 2 of us, always holding hands. When she was 17 and had her heart broken for the first time, she didn't go to her friends. She came and knocked on my bedroom door at midnight and sat on the edge of the bed and cried while I made her tea. I thought we were the kind of father and daughter who had built something real, something that didn't need to be earned or performed. I should have paid more attention to who she became when she met Theo. His name was Theo Baxter. He worked in finance in Toronto, drove a leased BMW, and had the kind of handshake that tells you everything about a man. A little too firm, a little too long, like he was making a point. He came from a family in Oakville. Old money, or at least old pretension, which is more common. His mother wore pearls to a backyard barbecue the first time she came to our house, and spent most of the afternoon standing near the garden rather than sitting with us, as though the chairs might stain her. Brooke changed around him. Slowly, the way water erodes stone, you don't notice it until you look at what's left. She started talking about the neighborhood she grew up in differently. Started referring to our house in Barrie as cozy, in the tone that means the opposite. She stopped correcting Theo when he made small remarks at dinner. When he called Marlene's tremor distracting. When he joked that maybe we should think about a care facility sooner rather than later, and laughed it off before anyone could respond. I said nothing at the time. Marlene squeezed my hand under the table and I let it go. The wedding was in September 2 years ago now. A Saturday, vineyard outside of Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was beautiful, I'll say that honestly, the kind of day that looks like a postcard, the kind of light you only get in Ontario in early fall. I paid for most of it. Not all the Baxters contributed what they called a meaningful share, which turned out to mean the rehearsal dinner and the flowers, the venue, the catering, the photographer, the open bar, the hotel block for 60 guests that came from me. Just over $82,000 over 18 months, because Brooke wanted the wedding she had always imagined, and I had always told her that when the day came, I would give her that. Marlene wore a blue dress. She'd had it altered twice to account for how much weight she'd lost that year. She looked beautiful. She was so proud. She teared up during the ceremony and grabbed my arm, and I covered her hand with mine, and we didn't need to say anything. Theo's parents didn't speak to Marlene once during the reception, I noticed. I filed it away. The text came 8 months after the wedding. Don't bring Dad to dinner. By Dad, she meant my wife, Marlene, her mother. This was Brooke's shorthand now. My wife had become "did" in the way inconvenient things get relabeled so they're easier to set aside. I called her instead of texting back. She picked up on the 3rd ring. She said it wasn't personal. She said Theo's work colleagues would be there, that it was a professional dinner more than a family one, that she just thought it might be. And here she paused, a lot for everyone to manage. I asked her what she meant by that. She said Marlene's condition had been progressing, that the tremors were more visible now, that she didn't want anyone to feel awkward. I said, "You mean you don't want Theo to feel awkward?" She said, "Dad, please don't make this harder than it is." I asked her if she remembered who had been there every single time something was hard for her. I asked her if she remembered the midnight tea. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she had to go, that Theo was waiting, and the line went quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. Marlene was in the living room watching the news. She hadn't heard the call. I went and sat beside her and she rested her head against my shoulder, and I watched the weather report and didn't say a word about it. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger, not yet, something quieter. The feeling you get when you've been generous with someone for a long time and you realize, with great clarity, that they've been keeping a ledger you didn't know about. and the numbers don't say what you thought they said. Over the next few months, things escalated in small ways. Brooke and Theo visited less. When they did come to Barry, Theo spent most of the time on his phone. Brooke started making comments about the house. Had we thought about downsizing? Had we considered that managing a property this size was a lot for two people, especially with Marlene's situation? I told her we were fine. The house was paid off. We had savings. Marlene had her specialists, her medication, her routines, and she was managing well. Then Brooke called in February to tell us she was pregnant. We were overjoyed. Truly. Marlene cried happy tears for the first time in months. I drove to Toronto the following weekend with a box of things. A blanket Marlene had knitted. A children's book I'd read to Brooke 100 times when she was small. A framed photograph of the three of us from a camping trip in Algonquin the summer Brooke was 6. I wanted them to have something real, something rooted. Theo answered the door. He looked at the box and said, "Oh, we're actually going in a different direction decorating-wise. Very modern, minimal. But thanks." He set the box beside the door like it was a delivery he hadn't ordered. Brooke came in from another room and looked embarrassed, which told me she'd already been briefed on the direction they were going. She hugged me, but it was brief. She asked if I wanted to see the nursery. I said yes. It was beautiful, everything white and gray and expensive. The knitted blanket my wife had spent 4 months making was not in it. On the drive back to Barrie, I thought about my father, about how he used to say that you learn who someone is not when things are easy but when they cost something. He meant money, partly, but he also meant time and effort and care. He meant what people choose to protect when there's something to lose. I had been thinking of Brooke as the girl who knocked on my door at midnight. I needed to start seeing who she had become. I want to be precise about what happened with the account because I've told this story to people, and they sometimes assume I acted out of spite. I didn't. I acted after a very long time of watching, and one specific moment that made the decision for me. In March, Brooke called and asked if I could transfer $50,000 into her and Theo's joint account, not as a gift, as a loan, her word, for a down payment on a larger house. They'd found something in Oakville near his parents' 5 bedrooms, new build. She said they wanted to raise the baby in a good school district. She said they would pay me back. She gave me a repayment schedule. She had prepared a document. I asked about their own savings. She said they were tied up. I didn't press on what that meant. I told her I needed to think about it. Then I called my financial advisor, a woman named Carol I'd worked with for 20 years, and asked her to run some numbers for me. Marlene's care was going to become more involved over time. Parkinson's doesn't plateau. It progresses, and the costs progress with it. Private home care in Ontario runs between $25 and $40 an hour. If Marlene needed consistent daily support in 3 or 4 years, we were looking at a significant annual cost. I had planned for this, but the plan assumed that the money stayed where I had put it. I told Carol what Brooke had asked for. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Gerald, what is your gut telling you?" I didn't answer right away, because my gut was telling me something I didn't want to hear. A week later, Brooke called again. She didn't ask about the transfer, she asked about the TFSA. Specifically whether I had named her as a beneficiary, and whether she was also named on the RRSP. She said she was just organizing her own financial planning and wanted to have a clear picture of the estate. She was 31 years old. Her mother was 62. We were both in reasonable health. Nobody was dying. I said I'd look into it. Then I sat in my office for a very long time. I thought about the box of things I'd brought to Toronto, the blanket, the photograph. Theo setting it by the door like a return shipment. I thought about Marlene in the blue dress, trembling slightly during the first dance. So proud she was almost incandescent, and Theo's parents standing at the edge of the room talking to each other. I thought about the 5-word text, "Don't bring Dad to dinner." I called my lawyer the following Monday. His name was Bert. We'd worked together for 15 years. I walked him through everything and asked him to help me restructure a few things. The beneficiary designations were updated. A new will was drafted. I made arrangements for the house to be held in a family trust with specific provisions for Marlene's care. Brooke's name remained in the documents, but the conditions changed significantly. Any inheritance would be managed through a trustee, not accessed directly, and tied to specific provisions I had outlined. I did not tell Brooke. I also did not transfer the $50,000. A month passed. She texted asking for an update. I said I was still reviewing. Another 2 weeks. She called. I said the same. She started to get impatient. I could hear it. That particular tightening in her voice that meant Theo was in the room and they'd been discussing it. Then she stopped calling entirely for 3 weeks, which told me everything. The baby was born on a Thursday in early June. A girl. I drove to Toronto with Marlene the next morning. Marlene had wrapped a new blanket different from the first one. Smaller, softer, pale yellow. She'd started it in April. The baby was small and dark-haired and perfect. I held her for about 20 minutes and didn't say much, just looked at her. Marlene held her and sang a few bars of something low and quiet, an old Patsy Cline song that her own mother used to sing. The baby's eyes were closed. She gripped Marlene's finger. Theo watched from across the room with his arms folded. Brooke was watching him. On the way home, Marlene said, "Something's wrong, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. I didn't answer right away. She said, "You don't have to protect me from it." I said, "I know." I told her most of it. Not all, not the financial details, not the RRSP question, which would have hurt her in a way I didn't want her to carry. But the rest, the text, the dinner, the loan request, and what it felt like coming from the same person who hadn't once asked how she was doing during those 3 weeks of silence. Marlene listened. Then she looked out the window at the highway for a long time. Finally she said, "I raised her better than that." I said, "I know you did," she said. "She chose something else." I didn't have anything to add to that. The moment everything came to a head was in August. Brooke called on a Sunday evening, not to check in, not to ask about Marlene, not to share anything about the baby. She called because Theo had been talking to a mortgage broker and they needed my financial statements as a co-signer on the Oakville house. Not the $50,000 anymore. They had found a way to qualify if I co-signed. They weren't asking for my money directly, just my name, just my credit, just my signature on a document that would tie my financial standing to theirs indefinitely. She made it sound routine. She said, "You'd just be helping us get a better rate." I said, "Brooke." She said, "What?" I said, "When was the last time you asked how your mother was doing?" There was a silence, a long one. She said, "I've been busy, you know I've been busy. We just had a baby." I said, "Your mother had a fall in the bathroom last month. She bruised her hip. She didn't want me to tell you because she didn't want to bother you." Another silence. I said, "I'm not co-signing anything." She said, "Dad, this is really important to us." I said, "I know it is. But you're not asking me to be your father right now. You're asking me to be a financial instrument. And I've been thinking for a long time about the difference." She started to say something. Then Theo's voice in the background, and she covered the phone and I could hear them talking, low and urgent. Then she came back and her voice had changed, harder now, with the particular coldness of someone who has been coached. She said, "Theo thinks you've been deliberately stringing us along, that you had no intention of helping us and were just stringing us along to feel in control." I didn't respond to that. I said, "Tell him I'll have my lawyer send over some updated documents this week. Both of you should take a look." She said, "What documents?" I said, "The ones you were so interested in back in March." I hung up. I won't tell you it felt good. That's not what it felt like. It felt like setting down something you've been carrying for so long your arms have gone numb, and only once it's down do you realize how much it was costing you. The lawyer sent the documents Thursday, the trust structure, the updated beneficiary arrangements, the conditions. Brooke called Friday morning early. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at noon. I listened to the message this time. She sounded frightened, which was not what I expected. Not angry the way I thought she'd be. Frightened. She called again that evening. I answered. She said, "I don't understand these documents." I said, "They're straightforward. Your mother's care is protected. The house is in trust. Any inheritance is managed through a third party. Nothing changes while your mother and I are alive," she said. "You're punishing us." I said, "I'm protecting your mother. Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet. Then, "Why didn't you tell us you were doing this?" I said, "Because you didn't ask. Not about this, and not about anything that mattered. For 8 months, Brooke. You didn't ask once how she was doing. You asked about TFSAs and co-signatures and repayment schedules." I heard her breath catch. I said, "I don't need you to agree with me, but I need you to understand that what I did because your mother comes first. She has always come first. And nothing, not the house in Oakville, not Theo's rate, not any amount of money, changes that." The line was quiet for a very long time. Then, in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her since she was a teenager, "Is she okay, Mom? Is she okay?" I said, "She has good days and harder ones. She'd like to hear from you." Brooke didn't say anything. I said, "The baby's grandparents are 64 and 62. Neither of us is going anywhere soon. But time doesn't wait for people to get comfortable, and neither does your mother's condition. You might want to think about what kind of relationship you actually want to have. Not for the inheritance, not for the co-signature. Just because she's your mother and she loves you and she's still here." I heard her crying, quietly the way she used to cry when she was trying not to. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't offer comfort the way I would have once, automatically as a reflex. I let it sit. Some things need to sit before they can move. 3 weeks later, Brooke showed up at the door in Barrie with the baby. No Theo. Just her and the car seat and a dish she'd made. Marlene's butter chicken recipe. The one I knew she had to have called her aunt in Calgary to get, because Marlene hadn't written it down and didn't remember she'd shared it with her sister 30 years ago. Marlene opened the door. I watched from the hallway. The two of them stood on the front step for a moment, Brooke holding the baby, Marlene looking at her daughter with an expression I cannot describe except to say that it was the most dignified grief and love I have ever seen on a human face. And then Brooke stepped forward, and the two of them held each other, carefully, because Marlene's balance isn't what it was, and neither of them said anything for a long time. I went back into the kitchen and put the kettle on. Theo and I have not spoken. I don't know what Brooke has told him. I don't know what version of events he's carrying or what he's made of the documents. That's not my concern. My concern is the woman in the living room right now, on the couch, holding her granddaughter while some afternoon quiz show plays in the background, singing that old Patsy Cline song again, low and slightly off-key. The baby watching her face with the absolute attention that only infants and people who are truly paying attention can manage. I made the tea. I carried it out. I set Marlene's mug on the side table where she could reach it. She looked up and said, "She has your mother's nose." I looked at the baby. I said, "She does." Marlene smiled. Not the careful smile she saves for when she's in pain or frightened or working hard to keep something together. The other one. The one I fell in love with 35 years ago in a coffee shop in Sudbury, before either of us knew anything about what was coming. When the world was still the size of one small table and a cup of coffee and a woman who laughed at something I said and looked at me like I might be worth knowing. I sat down beside her. Outside, the maples in the front yard had already started to turn. October in Ontario comes quietly without announcement. One morning you look up and the light has changed and the leaves are burning red and gold, and the whole world looks like it's on the edge of something. Not ending, exactly. Just becoming whatever comes next. I reached over and took Marlene's hand. She didn't look away from the baby. Neither did I.